Hello YouTube! We often enjoy artworks that have bad features, but usually we enjoy them in spite of their bad features. A movie might be very good overall despite having one actor who misinterprets the part, or despite having cheap special effects. Occasionally, however, there is an artwork that is enjoyed because of its bad features. Tommy Wiseau's The Room and Ed Wood's Planet 9 from Outer Space are classic examples from cinema, or the visual artworks displayed at the Museum of Bad Art. These artworks are often called so bad it's good. When an artwork is so bad it's good, we apparently enjoy the artwork because of the features that are bad, because it fails so spectacularly. People who enjoy The Room do so because of its terrible acting, its lack of narrative cohesion, its continuous use of cliches. Now, this category of art is aesthetically puzzling, but it's received very little attention from philosophers of art. Indeed, I can only find a couple of papers on this kind of art. There's Appreciating Bad Art by John Dyck and Matt Johnson, and there's a response to their article, Bad Art and Good Taste by Per Alganda, and that's pretty much it. So this is a highly underexplored area of aesthetics as far as I can tell. Dyck and Johnson call this category of art good bad art, and I will follow their usage here because that's easier than saying so bad it's good all the time. So good bad art, that's what we're talking about. Now, the central puzzle of good bad art is, well, how can an artwork be good because it's artistically bad? To say that something is good because it's bad seems to be bordering on incoherence. And notice that this is the case regardless of whether or not you take a realist or anti-realist approach to artistic value. No matter what your account is, whether you think of the value of an artwork as being objective, or whether you think that it's something that is in us, is something that we project onto the world, or whatever, it seems incoherent to say that an artwork is good because it's bad. So in this video we will look at some possible explanations of this phenomenon. Now, before we examine the solutions, it's worth delineating exactly what good bad art is. I suspect there will be quite a bit of disagreement about how this is to be defined, but I'm going to follow the discussion given by Dyck and Johnson, just because, as I said, their article is basically the only one. So the first point to make about good bad art is that the badness of good bad art is artistic in nature. Now, what exactly does it mean to say that something is artistically good or bad? Well, Dyck and Johnson are explicitly agnostic about this, but they do state a minimal constraint, that in the case of good bad art, for something to be artistically bad is for it to be the product of failed artistic intentions, execution, or poor artistic vision. They call this the failed intentions claim. So in general, what makes good bad art bad is artistic failure, where artistic failure is due to failed or flawed intentions. There's a failure to, either there's a failure to realise the goals, like a serious failure to realise the goals, or the artistic goals are themselves bad or flawed in some way. The point of the failed intentions claim is that the artistic value of an artwork is partly dependent on the intentions of the creator. Dyck and Johnson think that this is intuitively obvious, but they also give a couple of arguments for it. First of all, they say, to deny this, we would have to accept that it is reasonable to interpret Plan 9 from Outer Space, for instance, as a sophisticated send-up of the B-movie genre, even though that's at odds with what Ed Wood was actually trying to do with the film. And that just doesn't seem plausible, right? Like, it looks like that's just to interpret it incorrectly. You're just getting the film wrong if you look at it in that kind of way. We respond very differently to something like Plan 9 from Outer Space on the one hand, and something like Garth Marenghi's Dark Place on the other. I'm not sure how popular Dark Place is outside of the UK, but if you haven't seen it, well, you're missing out. Dark Place was it was intended to be a parody of low-budget 80s television, and it is brilliant. Anyway, the point is we respond differently to these works, and we attribute different aesthetic properties to these works because they are doing very different things. Ed Wood was genuinely trying to make an exciting science fiction thriller. Dark Place was a knowing parody, and that constrains how we can interpret these artworks. and the kind of aesthetic properties that these artworks have. Dyck and Johnson's second argument is that the failed intentions claim makes better sense of the actual practices, the practices of criticism and curation with respect to bad art. So inclusion in the Museum of Bad Art requires that the artwork was created by a person who was genuinely trying to produce good art. Their standards say, and I quote, that the artwork must have been created by someone who has seriously attempted to make an artistic statement, one that has gone horribly awry in either its concept or execution. Of course, there is an epistemic worry about the failed intentions claim because we may not know the intentions of the artist. Sometimes this will be very difficult to determine. This is certainly a problem for paintings which have unknown creators, but I think, in general, we often know enough about the artist to have some idea, and actually it's usually fairly obvious just from the artwork itself. I mean, Dark Place, for example, is just obviously a parody. Whereas I think, with Plan 9, even if you didn't know anything about how it was created, it would seem like this is just a low-budget B-movie. Anyway, with this in mind, Dyck and Johnson distinguish good bad art from several other categories of art, in particular camp, kitsch, and outsider art. Camp, they say, is often intended to look bad. Campiness is intentional. They cite the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was an homage to classic B-movies. It looks schlocky, but the schlockiness is not a product of failed intentions. It's supposed to be that way. And as we've noted, works that are intentionally ironic, like Rocky Horror or like Dark Place, and works that are sincerely bad, like The Room or Plan 9, seem to warrant different types of appreciation. Good bad art involves sincere intentions that have failed to be executed. Then there's kitsch. Kitsch, Dyck and Johnson say, is distinguished by sentimentality. The painter Thomas Kincaid is one of the more prominent examples. Good bad art need not be sentimental, though of course it can be, but not all kitsch art is good bad art. Some kitsch is just bad. Finally, outsider art. Outsider art is work created by outsider artists, those artists who have no formal training and who are in some important sense uninfluenced by art world trends, artists outside the art world. Now, many of the classic pieces of outsider art are just good. I mean, they're just good pieces of art. They're not good bad art, they're just good art. Take the unique architecture of somebody like Ferdinand Cheval. Good bad art often results from interaction with the mainstream art world, from the attempt to imitate popular trends, so it may not be outsider art in any sense. With all this said then, let's turn to our puzzle. How can an artwork be good because it is artistically bad? Well, one response to this, which is mentioned briefly by Dyck and Johnson, is to hold that there's actually really no puzzle here at all, because good bad works are not actually artworks, and since they don't count as artworks, there is no problem of good bad art. Their status as artworks might be denied on the basis that they have failed too badly in their aims, or that they do not exhibit the right kind of skill, and maybe a necessary feature of art is that it exhibits skill, or something like that. There are two obvious problems with taking this response. The first is that it will inevitably rest on a highly controversial definition of art. If you take the skill definition, well, it seems like there are plenty of canonical artworks which, by any reasonable standard of what counts as skill, involve less skill than many good bad works. Duchamp's Fountain surely required less skill to create than even something like Wiseau's Room. More importantly, the puzzle remains regardless of how the objects are categorised. Suppose we say that The Room is not actually an artwork. Well, that's kind of irrelevant, right? Because the problem is that The Room is so bad it's good. And it will remain so bad it's good, even if it isn't art. So this response does, I think, seem to be pretty hopeless. Okay, let's turn to some more plausible responses. The assumption that we've made in describing this puzzle is that there are artworks that are good because of their overwhelmingly bad features. Badness somehow creates goodness. Call this the good-bad assumption. Well, we might respond by simply denying this assumption. Basically, we deny that anything is ever really so bad it's good. There are two ways to deny this assumption. We might deny that the works are good in the relevant sense, or we might deny that the features that make them good are bad features. Either way, it's going to be strictly speaking misleading to say that an artwork is so bad it's good. So, first option. Say that the artworks in question are actually just bad. They're not good. We don't really derive pleasure or appreciation from these artworks. Now, some may find this perfectly intuitive. There are, I assume, people out there who just don't enjoy good, bad art. These artworks are just too bad for them to derive any pleasure from them. But, you know, similarly, there are some people who don't enjoy horror films because they're too scary, or they don't enjoy heavy metal because it's too loud. In general, not everybody enjoys every genre. There are enough people who take pleasure in good, bad art and who treat it as a genre in its own right that it seems there is a genuine phenomenon here. So if this kind of response is to have any plausibility, we're going to need to account for why people seek out these artworks without supposing that the artworks themselves are of positive value. Now, one option is what we might call the Schadenfreude theory. This is the idea that when we engage with good, bad art, we take pleasure from feeling a kind of Schadenfreude towards the creators. We take pleasure in their massive failure. The massive artistic failure of the artwork makes it amusing, because failure in general can be amusing when it happens to others. And indeed, this seems like just the right kind of situation where we might expect Schadenfreude. On the one hand, the failure is very obvious and visceral. You watch something like The Room, you maybe even cringe at the thought of somebody presenting this as a serious film. So, you know, the failure is obvious, the failure is visceral, but it's also a low-stakes situation. Nobody's actually getting hurt by this. So, yeah, you have obvious failure, but nobody really getting hurt. This is exactly the sort of situation where you can kind of take some amusement in the failure of others. So, anyway, on this view, the value of these artworks is not really in the artworks themselves, but in the actions of the creators. The artwork actually isn't good in any way, it's just bad. But because it's so bad, we find this failure of the creators pleasing. Now, Dyck and Johnson raise a couple of objections to this kind of view. First, it doesn't explain why good bad art can reward sustained and repeated attention. Good bad art can be highly appealing and can remain so over time. Dyck and Johnson don't think we would expect this if all we were getting from it was Schadenfreude. Indeed, if Schadenfreude is the motivation, why bother engaging with the artworks themselves at all? It looks like there are faster ways to achieve the same end. You could just, I don't know, read a list of box office bombs or something, maybe, or maybe just watch like clips. You know, there's clips on YouTube of the worst parts of these artworks. If Schadenfreude were the motivation, you know, just look at the worst parts and look at how badly it did at the box office, and then you'd presumably get the same response, right? A second and more serious problem is that if this account were accurate, then we would similarly appreciate every artwork that is a massive failure. There would be no distinction between good bad art and plain old bad art, but there is, because some artworks are just boring. Some artworks are, you know, they're just bad. They're not so bad they're good. They're boring. Indeed, on the Schadenfreude account, arguably we should appreciate the plain old bad art even more strongly, because it fails in a more complete way than good bad art. Schadenfreude would surely be diminished by the fact that good bad artworks have fans. They sometimes have a cult following. So the general conclusion to be drawn from this is that good bad art doesn't simply fail, it has to fail in the right kind of ways. But it looks like it still has to be entertaining in some ways. It still has to be engaging. Presumably, if the artwork contained, I don't know, a half an hour of literally somebody just filming paint drying, well, that would just be bad. Okay, second option for those who wish to deny that the artworks in question are good is rich experience theory. This view was proposed by Aaron Smuts as a response to a different problem in philosophy of art, the paradox of tragedy. I have a couple of videos on the paradox of tragedy if you're interested in learning more about that debate. Anyway, in a nutshell, rich experience theory says that we sometimes want to experience bad things just for the sake of the experience. We are not always motivated only to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Rather, what we want out of life are rich experiences, where these experiences may be positive or negative. A rich experience is an experience that involves novel and unfamiliar things, so it adds variety to your life. It may have a deeper meaning or significance to your life. It may engage your capacities for empathy and imagination. Rich experiences don't need to be particularly sophisticated. As a mundane example, consider eating a hot chili. You know that it's hot, you know what it's going to do, you know that you'll hate it, but you do it anyway because it's just a novel experience. At least according to the rich experience theory, one of the reasons why you do this is just because you want variety, you want to experience these things. I sometimes, when I have a mouth ulcer, I sometimes jab my tongue into it just to experience what that's like. And it's painful. I know it's going to be painful. I'm not a masochist. I don't get off on inflicting pain. I just have the drive to experience this for some reason. Humans are curious. We want a life that contains lots of different kinds of experiences. We don't just want to experience good, pleasant things. I mean, obviously, we don't want to experience anything like really terrible, but we want some variety of hedonic value, let's say. Then the claim will be that good bad art is capable of affording rich experiences despite its artistic failures. In fact, the claim is that good bad art is capable of affording rich experiences in virtue of its artistic failures. On this view, good bad art isn't good. It's not good at all. It doesn't actually have any positive value, nor do we find positive value elsewhere, as on the Schadenfreude view. Rather, it's specifically the negative experiences that we're looking for. So it's not that these artworks are so bad that they're good, rather they're just bad, or they're bad in a particular kind of way that makes them interesting. For the same kind of reason that eating a hot chili might be interesting. You know, some artworks aren't going to count, right? Like if there was a film that had like 30 minutes of paint drying, well, that's just boring. That's not a rich experience. That's not anything new and novel. But Plan 9 from Outer Space, well, there's enough going on in it, and it displays such an odd kind of incompetence that it is something novel, so it affords a rich experience. You can watch the Paradox of Tragedy video for more on rich experience in general, so I won't go into all of the details of this theory here. I'll note only the problem as it pertains to good bad art. The main issue is that it doesn't really tell us exactly why good bad art affords a rich experience. What exactly are the properties? What properties of the artwork are we actually engaging with here? The worry is that once we fill this in, right, once we explain which properties constitute the rich experience for us, it might turn out that those properties are actually just aesthetically positive, right? So it might turn out that the artwork is good overall. Rich experience theory applies well to something like a tragedy that provokes sadness, or a horror film that provokes fear or disgust, because those emotions genuinely seem to be negative, right? Like fear is usually considered to be genuinely a negative emotion. So rich experience theory helps explain why people will watch horror films that provoke fear. But it's not at all obvious that our experience of good bad art is actually negative in any way. Many of these artworks are viewed as being quite fun. So those were two views that denied that the artworks are good in the relevant way. As mentioned, there is another way to deny that any artworks are so bad that they're good, and this is to deny that the artworks are bad in the relevant way. On this view, the artworks are simply good, and the features that make the artworks good are themselves good, not bad. Now, initially, this might strike most people as a rather strange position. Surely The Room has bad acting and appalling dialogue. But bear in mind that when we evaluate artworks, we take them as a whole. We make an all things considered evaluation. We have to consider each part in the context of all the other parts. So a property that is bad under normal circumstances can be good in the right context. Take, for instance, Nicolas Cage at his most cagey. There are plenty of films where that kind of acting wouldn't work. It would just be bad. Or at least that's what many people think, incorrectly. But many people think that, there are very few contexts where Nicolas Cage at his most cagey is something that's good. But in the right kind of film, most people will grant that it does work, that it can be fantastic. So, similarly, in the vast majority of films, Tommy Wiseau's acting would indeed be awful. But The Room is in many ways not a normal film, and in that context, in the context of everything else that's happening there, it works. It ends up being positive. So, yeah, I mean, the thought of this is, well, look, it may just be that people simply appreciate features that are standardly considered bad. I mean, I know this is the case with some of my favourite artworks. I'm a big fan of classic Doctor Who. Now, these stories that feature the wobbly sets, the monsters made of bubble wrap, the terrible synthesizer music, the hammy B-movie acting, the alien planets that all look suspiciously like British quarries, all of these, to me, are good things about the show. I wouldn't describe it as so bad it's good, it's just good. I mean, if you take something like the effects, well, yes, they're not realistic, but I don't always want realism. In many ways, it feels more artistically imaginative. Anyway, I can definitely see somebody appreciating Plan 9 from Outer Space with a similar frame of mind. I mean, but to put my own cards on the table here, I don't actually have the so bad it's good response. Like, that's literally not something I experience. So to me, this kind of response is actually quite persuasive. At least it describes how I approach artworks. Part of the reason why I did this video and I started reading about this topic was because I wanted to understand just what it's like to have this response, to feel like an artwork is so bad it's good. And unfortunately, I don't think I do understand. But anyway, that's just me. So, one objection to this is to appeal to the failed intentions claim. The point about The Room is that it utterly fails to do what Wiseau intended. Or at least that Wiseau's intentions were in some way defective. That's what makes it artistically bad. Even if you happen to enjoy it. Like, yes, you enjoy it, but you enjoy it in a way that is completely contrary to Wiseau's intentions. But, this point may not be so strong. I mean, while an artist's intentions may well be relevant in judging an artwork, there are other factors to consider as well, not least just the content of the artwork in itself, considered on its own terms. Failed intentions do not in themselves make an artwork bad. Suppose, for example, that, like imagine, that it had been the case that Blade Runner was intended to portray Deckard as the hero and Roy Batty as the villain. Suppose that was the intention. I don't think it was, but suppose that was what the creators had in mind. In that case, I would say that it utterly fails in its intentions, because Deckard is literally a slave hunter and kind of rapey, and Batty is a slave who just wants freedom and more life. Blade Runner is deeply morally ambiguous. That's part of what makes it great. And I think it would still be great, even if it wasn't intended to be morally ambiguous, even if it was intended as a straightforward kind of hero versus villain film. It would still be a masterpiece, partly because of its moral ambiguity. And in any case, you've got to bear in mind that intentions may often be unknown or just indeterminate. This will certainly be the case for many films, which will involve a number of artists all collaborating, all with different intentions. So, the intentions of the creator might not actually pick out any precise, determinate set of intentions. So for this reason, I wouldn't say that the value of an artwork, that artistic value, is just a matter of how well the artwork fulfills the artist's intentions. Another problem for this kind of response, though, is that it seems to straightforwardly clash with our linguistic practices and with many people's intuitions. People frequently describe artworks as so bad they're good. And it seems that the way that people appreciate these artworks is very different from how we appreciate normal artworks. If these artworks were all things considered good, then there really is no difference here. Basically, if this response were correct, then it seems that most people would just give an ordinary analysis of good, bad artworks. They would just say, well, this artwork is good because of X, Y, Z. They'd say, the room is good because of X, Y, Z, because I find it amusing in these ways, or whatever. But they don't say that. They say it's bad because of these features, and that the badness also somehow makes it good. There may be other ways to account for our standard talk here. When a person says that the room is bad, we might interpret them as simply recognising that this artwork contains many properties that are standardly considered to be bad. Your aesthetic standards may differ from conventional aesthetic standards in various ways, but you can still recognise what the conventional aesthetic standards are. Now, we can all see that by conventional aesthetic standards, the room has terrible acting, but the very features that are terrible on those conventional aesthetic standards are features that we like, right? So in describing it as bad, we are reporting what we take to be the artwork's status per the mainstream aesthetic conventions, and in describing it as good, we are reporting its status per our own standards. Artworks that are particularly bad in conventional ways, according to the conventional standards, can be good by our standards. If you're taking pleasure in it, then it's good for you. Now, of course, this is a rather anti-realist take on the issue. I'm not sure if this kind of response would be available to a realist about aesthetic value. But anyway, that's what we might do. We might sort of reinterpret the way that people standardly talk about these artworks. It's also worth noting that standard intuitions here just might not be reliable. So yes, it is true that many people intuitively feel that some artworks are so bad they're good, but there's also the intuition that this is kind of incoherent, that this sort of doesn't make sense. That's exactly why we're talking about this. That's why there's a puzzle here. It doesn't seem to make sense to say that something can be good because it's bad. Well, maybe it is just incoherent to say this. Maybe it doesn't really make sense. Okay, so we've seen a variety of responses that work by denying the good-bad assumption. Suppose we accept this assumption. Suppose we accept that these works are good because of their artistically bad features. Where then does the positive value of good-bad art lie? Well, the general idea of any response along these lines will be that we can appreciate a work of art with a non-artistic mode of appreciation. We see non-artistic value in the work. So although the work is artistically bad, it's good in some other sense, in virtue of its artistic badness. So one option here, a very general approach to this would be to appeal to non-aesthetic value. Educational value would be one example. On this approach, when we engage with these works, we reflect on how they fail, and this informs us about artistic success in comparison, and it gives us useful information, useful and interesting information. It's useful to engage with bad artworks in order to learn about art more generally, learn about the standards of success and failure. Now, while good bad art can be appreciated in this way, it doesn't seem to solve our puzzle. First of all, it just seems wrong to say that people engage with good bad art in this frame of mind. Most people who watch The Room do so for fun, not because they want to acquire information. People do seem to be deriving aesthetic pleasure from these works. Second, on this view, there is again not really any distinction between good bad art and just plain old bad art, because we can learn from both of them, right? Doesn't have to be. There doesn't seem to be a difference here. Let's turn to the final option, which is defended by Dyck and Johnson in their article. Dyck and Johnson's view involves a general claim and a more specific claim. The general claim is that there is a distinction between aesthetic value and artistic value, and that good bad art is aesthetically good due to its artistic badness. So this rests on a distinction between aesthetic appreciation and artistic appreciation. Now, in general, this is a fairly uncontroversial distinction. Artistic appreciation involves judging something to be an artistic success. And since, by stipulation, good bad artworks are artistic failures, it would be incoherent to claim to artistically appreciate good bad art in this sense. But there is also non-artistic aesthetic appreciation, which does not involve evaluating artistic success. We aesthetically appreciate various items that are not artworks, like landscapes. So we may value things in a way that is aesthetic, but non-artistic. And this is the case, Dyck and Johnson suggest, for good bad art. Good bad art is aesthetically good in virtue of its artistically bad features. So, in the case of good bad art, the artistic failure is obviously an artistic defect, but it's an aesthetic merit. And since there are different, since there are different types of aesthetic appreciation, the artwork is bad in one way but not in the other. So there's no incoherence here. What exactly is artistic value? Well, as we've seen, for Dyck and Johnson, it's connected to the intentions of the creator. Artistic value is a matter of the achievement of the artist. An artwork is artistically bad when the intentions of the artist fail in a particular kind of way, which is left somewhat unspecified, but by now we should have a sense of what they're getting at. Either the artist fails to execute their artistic goal, or their artistic goal is bad for one reason or another. So, for example, if the artist intends to create a scene that is supposed to be romantic, but ends up seeming creepy or rapey. A lot of romance scenes in older movies look a bit dodgy now because the woman is too resistant or the guy too aggressive. Or if the artist intends to excite the audience with a thrilling chase scene, but it's badly edited and has poor effects, so it just seems boring. We've already discussed this kind of view and some of the problems with it. This leaves the question then of what exactly does the non-artistic aesthetic appreciation consist in? And there are different ways to fill this out. There are lots of different things that we might cite as constituting the non-artistic aesthetic value. And this brings us to Dyck and Johnson's specific claim, a claim about what exactly the aesthetic value of good bad art is. Here they propose what we might call bizarreness theory. They say that the artistic failure in works of good bad art makes those works bizarre, where something is bizarre if it prompts incredulity, bewilderment, or puzzlement. In the case of good bad art, works that are intended to produce one kind of effect end up, through the incompetence of the creators, producing a totally different effect. The intended effect and the actual effect clash in a striking way, a way that prompts incredulity on part of the viewer. The viewer is left thinking something like, how could anyone think that this is a good idea? Consider the cheesy sex scenes of The Room. With these scenes, the movie is attempting to be sexy and to establish character development, but they're so over the top, and the scenes use such cliched tropes like the roses and soft music that it all just seems silly. But it's not just silly, it's bizarre, because we just don't understand how a person could think that such scenes would produce the intended effect. How could anyone think that this is sexy? Or in Plan 9 from Outer Space, we experience Ed Wood's intention to create a thrilling science fiction film with relevant social messages, with the confused narrative, the terrible effects, the nonsensical dialogue that is actually on screen. These two things clash weirdly. The mismatch is bizarre. And the quality of bizarreness, in these instances at least, is a positive aesthetic virtue. So an aesthetic virtue arises out of artistic failure, the failure of the intentions of the creator, or the poor intentions of the creator, end up creating something aesthetically good. And notice this does allow us to account for the difference between good bad art and plain old bad art, because there are plenty of cases of artworks where we actually do understand what the artist is trying to do, or we understand why the artist could have thought that it would work, right? but it just, it's boring, or it fails for some other reason. Like we get what's going on. We don't have this feeling of incredulity about it, but it's still bad. So that allows us to account for the difference between good, bad, and plain old bad artworks. Now, bizarreness can, of course, be intentional. Some artworks are purposefully bizarre. What distinguishes good bad art is that it is unintentionally bizarre. The bizarreness arises precisely from the artistic failure and the failure of the artist to execute her intentions properly. When bizarreness occurs unintentionally, it has a unique aesthetic effect. The lack of intention exacerbates our sense of bewilderment, the "how could anyone think this is a good idea" reaction. If you compare this to the work of someone like David Lynch, well, Lynch is bizarre, but even if you dislike him, it's understandable why he thought his artistic decisions were good ideas. Lynch's work is obviously underwritten by an intention for bizarreness. He wants his viewers to feel bewildered about the content of the work, and he achieves that well. The creators of good bad art have no such intentions, which makes their works bizarre in a more complete way. Lynch's underlying intention of bizarreness provides some sense of order and coherence to his work. We get what Lynch is doing, even if we don't get why he's doing it. The unintentional bizarreness of good bad art has a unique aesthetic feel to it. The bizarreness is unexplainable. It's seductive. It engages our curiosity. Of course, unintentional bizarreness is not always an aesthetic virtue. We might describe the motivations of a character as bizarre, and this might just be a flaw in the work. Maybe the artwork would have been better if the character had been better explained, better developed. So bizarreness isn't always a virtue, but of course that's not unique to bizarreness. Indeed, pretty much all aesthetic properties can be good or bad, depending on the context. Now, as I noted then, Dyck and Johnson can be seen as advancing a general claim. The general claim is this distinction between aesthetic appreciation in general and then specifically artistic appreciation in particular. And then the specific claim is that the aesthetic value of good bad art is bizarreness. Now, regarding this specific claim, the main question is whether this kind of bizarreness does in fact account for all of the good bad artworks. And the problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be plenty of debate about what actually counts as a good bad artwork. As we saw earlier in the video, Dyck and Johnson define good bad art in a rather narrow way, as requiring failed artistic intentions. But consider, for example, the movies of Troma. Troma movies are not send-ups of B-movies. They just are B-movies. They're not send-ups of exploitation movies. They just are exploitation movies. Many of them are considered to be classic examples of good bad art. But the Troma team knew exactly what they were doing. So there's no bizarreness due to a clash between intended effect and actual effect, right? Most of these Troma movies achieved the effect they were trying to achieve. But a lot of people would still consider them to be good bad art. So Dyck and Johnson's approach would not work here. What about then the general claim, the distinction between artistic appreciation and non-artistic aesthetic appreciation as applied to artworks? Well, Dyck and Johnson are surely correct that there's a distinction here, because we can aesthetically appreciate non-art objects. How this distinction applies to artworks themselves is a little less clear. In fact, there's a general danger here of collapsing into response number 3. This was so response number 3 is the denial that the artworks are actually bad in the relevant way. Response number 3 just says, no, these artworks are good. It seems that any story we give of the aesthetic value of good bad art can be adopted by the defender of response 3. So we say that the non-artistic aesthetic value is derived from property X, whatever that may be. Dyck and Johnson say it's bizarreness, but it could be anything, right? Property X. Well then, the defender of 3 can say that, all things considered, the room is actually artistically good. because it has property X. Well, the room is actually artistically good because it's bizarre, because all of its pieces fit together in such a way that it ends up being bizarre, and that's good. Although under normal circumstances, Tommy Wiseau's acting would be very bad, when taken in conjunction with all of the other features of the artwork and the facts about its creation, it ends up being good. Basically, the concern here is that we can just say that the property cited as having non-artistic aesthetic value actually just has artistic value. And it's difficult to see how we could rule this kind of response out in the absence of any well-accepted theory about what counts as artistic value or artistic appreciation. And of course, no such theory exists. I mean, Dyck and Johnson do give a theory of artistic value, connecting it to the intentions of the creator, but that's really controversial. The very fact that they're having to apply this controversial distinction to artworks is perhaps a problem for their theory. Indeed, Dyck and Johnson's use of the artistic non-artistic distinction is arguably self-undermining. Recall that on Dyck and Johnson's view, the artistic failure produces bizarreness, or whatever other supposedly non-artistic property is cited as conferring value. Artistic vice gives rise to an aesthetic virtue. But that means that in detecting the bizarreness, we are evaluating the work artistically. We are considering the artwork's artistic properties and artistic value. And that's the case no matter what we say is required for artistic evaluation, no matter what we say counts as artistic value, right? So in order to recognize the artistic failure, we have to be considering the work artistically. We must have the artistic appreciation sense switched on. So in appreciating the bizarreness, right, we only do that by evaluating the artistic properties of the work. And, so it looks like that it may be somewhat self-undermining here. We're not simply appreciating the work non-artistically when we appreciate the bizarreness, because in order to appreciate the bizarreness, we have to be evaluating the artistic properties, even on Dyck and Johnson's own view. Now, Dyck and Johnson themselves note this objection, and they respond that artistic appreciation is a necessary precondition for appreciating good bad works. Nevertheless, they say our appreciation is not solely artistic. The artistic appreciation is just a necessary precondition. We appreciate the bizarre mix of intended artistic effects and actual artistic effects, the disparity between artistic aims and our actual responses. But that they think that this is not an evaluation of an artistic property. They compare this to the appreciation of an architectural ruin, where our aesthetic appreciation, so in aesthetically appreciating an architectural ruin, we're responding both to what the original architect intended for the structure and to how time has ravaged the structure. We are appreciating how human intentions play out in particular environments. I must say, it's not really clear to me that this kind of case is really analogous to good bad art. With an architectural ruin, the environment literally alters the work in a substantial way. This is non-artistic aesthetic evaluation, because what we're looking at isn't really even by the artist anymore. It's more like a collaborative work between the artist and nature. A ruin is not exactly an art object. It's something between an artifact and, I don't know, a landscape, right? So that's why when you appreciate a ruin, you can't just be evaluating it as art, or at least it would be very odd to say that you're evaluating it only as art. With good bad art, by contrast, we are just engaging with the artist's creation. So yeah, I'm not sure that analogy is particularly helpful in this context. Well, anyway, those were some views about what it means to say that an artwork is so bad it's good. And that's all I have to say. As I've mentioned, there's really very, very little that has been written on this in the literature. It's surprisingly very underexplored, even though it seems to me to be quite an intriguing topic. Okay then, that's all for now. Goodbye.